Hello, friends. Today we are talking with Dr. Tabea Hoffmann, environmental psychologist and postdoctoral researcher at the University of Vermont. We'll be diving into her recently published paper titled Overcoming Inaction, an agent-based modelling study of social interventions that promote systemic environmental change. Now, that sounds like a technical and kind of overwhelming title, but you'll find as we talk about it, we dive under the hood and explore some very normal day-to-day things we do that are so normal they can be invisible to us. And we'll talk about how we either talk, like how we are talking in public about our green behaviours and show or signal our behaviours in ways that you can physically see, and how all these things affect other people in what we call a social feedback loop. Although these words sound really big and technical, what we talk about reminded me of this really fun example that happened during San Francisco in COVID, where there was this artist who made these big honey bear signs, like the plastic bottle of a bear that has honey in it. I don't know why he started making art with pictures of honey bears with masks, and they all have a different theme. Like some are kind of rainbow, some are wearing sunglasses, some are wearing different hats. It might have been a way to kind of like provide some positivity or encouragement when we were all sort of locked inside and wearing masks. And it was this way to socially signal. So in a city like San Francisco, probably also in New York, when you're walking along the street, you can see into other people's windows. That doesn't really happen in the suburbs so much. But these urban windows are these perfect places for putting out a signal. And that is what we mean when Tabea is talking about a social feedback loop, is that we want to be putting these positive signals that support pro-environmental behaviour in places where they are visible, where they are showing that this is what we represent, this is the social norm, this is what everybody around us is doing, because let's face it, that is a major driver of what drives our behaviour, is what we think is normal and what we think is expected of us. This podcast was recorded inside the School of Climate Action Design community. If you are a member of the School of Climate Action Design, you can join these live events. You can be a part of these interviews, and you can also ask our expert guests questions and further explore the research. Each guest is also a member in the school platform, and you can follow up with them and direct chat with them. If you haven't already signed up to the School of Climate Action Design, there is a link in the bio to join us. It's amazing. There's amazing people in there and amazing content. And everything we do, including this conversation you're about to have right now, will help you have those magical moments about exactly what it takes to drive engagement and to drive change in your community.
Welcome to the show, Tabea. It's wonderful to have you here and have the opportunity to explore your research paper.
Hi, Katie. Thanks you for having me.
So what I ask all of the guests to start off is that most on-the-ground sustainability and climate professionals working as climate managers in local cities, or they could be sustainability managers in corporations, have never heard of environmental psychology, often don't even come from a behavioral science lens at all. It's quite foreign to them. Why is that a problem when all of us in the practical job of trying to protect the environment really don't know this space very well at all?
Well, I think psychology and environmental psychology specifically has a lot of insights for those who work with sustainable behavior, who hope to foster sustainable behavior in their communities. I think specifically, because you mentioned it, people who work in municipalities could really make use of insights from environmental psychology, but so can also leaders in larger organizations, but also just people who hope to produce change. And part of that is because behavior is so central to pro-environmental change, and also the fact that climate change is a collective action problem, which comes with all kinds of psychological challenges where people only want to pitch in when they are expecting that other people are doing something as well. And so producing pro-environmental change is a lot about our social expectations, as I also write in this paper that we're going to discuss later, and that is inherently a psychological phenomenon. And then what we've also seen over the years is that there has been a lot of technological innovation, that from other fields, a lot of solutions are being provided But at the end of the day, it's so important that people are adopting these solutions. Think of sustainable technologies such as sustainable mobile phones, but also bigger investments such as solar panels. At the end of the day, it comes down to individuals adopting this technology and these innovations. And then over time, we will see changes at the group level and at the collective level.
Yeah, I mean, you might have just answered it with what you just said, but one question people ask me a lot is, why do you look at individual behavior when what we really need is systems change? I mean, it seems like the research that you do is really unpacking pretty deeply into that question. Or how do you answer it when people ask you the same question?
Yeah, I think this is a topic that's also widely discussed in my field, and I think sometimes there's this false dichotomy that is created between individual level and system level change, and to some extent, there's also truth in that, because very clearly, if I change a policy that is about system level change, and if I personally decide to bike to work every Monday, then that's clearly an individual level change. But these things are connected, and that is we only see system level change because individuals are pushing for such system level change. Systems are made out of people, interactions between people. And often what we see is that change starts with a few people, then it becomes a group of people, and eventually it ripples out to the entirety of society. But at the start of it was individual level change. And we should also not forget that someone's individual level change can inspire other people and yet again ripple out to create larger change. So to some extent, collective or system level change starts with some individuals.
Yeah, that sounds beautifully encapsulated. I think I will transcribe that chunk of what you just said and put it out on a post, because you just summarized that really beautifully. Another thing I've noticed also especially with this recent group that we've brought into this school, is that we've got a pretty advanced level of sustainability practitioners who are working at the systems level, and they're coming to look at individual behavior change, because they realize once they're pushing at the systems level to try to get new laws, new infrastructure through, or new initiatives by companies, is that it's actually being held back by not being able to influence people at the individual level. It's the individual behaviors that are actually like stopping people being able to get the systems change through. So you start to really see this relationship between that they really kind of have to be happening kind of together as an organism. You can't just change the system and just ignore everybody individually and then, think that you can just make these big scale changes without having a population that's like ready to adopt it.
Yeah, I think especially in a political context, maybe you can do that in a company, but especially in a political context, that is not advised to do. And building change together with a community or based on what a community wants is so much more legitimate and will be so much more effective.
Well, let's jump into your paper. What was the big insight or kind of aha moment that you got out of this paper?
I think this paper provides two types of insights, somewhat at different levels. One is methodological. So we use an agent-based model, which very basically, on a very basic level, is a computer simulation of individuals and how individual behavior can accumulate to some group level phenomenon. And that has been used already for many years in other fields, but it's not been used as much in environmental psychology. And using it is super helpful if you think of pro-environmental change the way we think in this paper about pro-environmental change. And that's, to repeat what I said earlier, this idea that there's some sort of individual level behavior that accumulates to system level change. And the other insight in this paper, and then maybe again methodologically, this idea that maybe we don't need to immediately develop an intervention and test it out in some community, but that we can refine this intervention. We can group together some theories, collect some data, and then refine an intervention in a virtual setting, not immediately targeting a community, which has also something to do with keeping trust and being fair to communities that you're placing interventions in. And then, of course, there's also content level insights in the paper, and that is mostly about which interventions could be most helpful in correcting what we call norm misperceptions. So misperceptions about what other people do and what other people think is important.
Could we dive into a bit of a glossary of terms? Because often these terms are not very well understood by people, but they carry a lot of really interesting meaning. Why don't we start with what you just mentioned, normative expectations? What is that? And why does it matter in an environmental context?
Yeah, so this is a term that comes from research on social norms more broadly. And there's this idea that people have normative and empirical expectations. And empirical expectations are expectations about what other people do. So, for example, I think that my neighbors eat vegetarian every now and then. And then normative expectations are expectations about what other people approve of. And that could be, I think that my neighbors approve of eating a vegetarian meal every now and then.
Okay, and how do you describe a social norm? Because not everybody still knows what a social norm is.
I would say maybe there's also some debate about what is a social norm, but I would say a social norm is what people generally perceive as normal behavior. So it's very much in the word, what is normal and acceptable behavior within my community, my reference network.
And I noticed you used this phrase or a term that I hadn't seen before, which was the social feedback loop. Usually when we're thinking of feedback loops, when I think of feedback loops, I'm thinking of like electricity meters and Fitbits on your wrist. What is a social feedback loop? And can you expand upon it a bit in the context of your paper?
In the context of my paper or our paper, the social feedback loop describes this idea that our norm perceptions, so what we think is normal and acceptable behavior, and in our paper in a given neighborhood, in my neighborhood, for example, it doesn't exist in a vacuum, but it depends on what we are observing around us and what we hear others tell us. And so this feedback loop describes this idea that we learn from others what is normal and acceptable behavior, and then start adopting that behavior or start assimilating us to whatever we think is expected of us. And by that, we provide an opportunity for yet again another person in our community to observe this behavior or to hear that this is the normal and acceptable behavior. And that's how this feedback loop rolls or ripples through a community.
Okay, so it's a lot about this idea of this perception of what is accepted and what is normal of everyone around us. So our behavior is dictated by what we perceive is normal and accepted by everyone. But what you dive into is that perception is not necessarily that accurate. Like what we think other people think is not actually like what they actually think, which might sound a bit confusing. But that's sort of tied into this concept of pluralistic ignorance. Can you sort of unpack that a bit about how our perceptions of the norms are not necessarily accurate and how that damages the environmental movement or our behaviors?
Yeah. So in some sense, understanding what is normal and acceptable behavior is a guessing game. We are puzzling that together from the cues in our social environment. And there are behaviors, for example, as a child or as a teenager or also later in life, where we are explicitly told this is what you're supposed to do and this is what you're not supposed to do. For example, with affirmative laws, but also parents or teachers can give us this type of guidance, but we don't have that for every behavior. And what we argue in the paper is that for sustainable behavior, it's more of this guessing game that I've mentioned earlier, and that we're just observing what is happening around us, and from there we're making assumptions. Often, the assumptions work like that we observe a certain behavior and think that that is an expression of who someone truly is, and that is an expression of their convictions. And because we often don't observe pro-environmental behavior because, one, it's not super common, or many pro-environmental behaviors are somewhat lagging, or we cannot really observe them. They're happening behind closed doors, such as being a vegetarian. We cannot necessarily observe whether our neighbor is a vegetarian. And then some behaviors are also ambiguous. We don't know why somebody has a beautiful green garden with many flowers. Is it for sustainable reasons, to promote a biodiverse environment, or is it simply aesthetics? And so these behaviors are difficult for us to interpret. And therefore, we might not always end up with the conclusion that our neighbors or the other people in our community really care about environmental protection, about climate change mitigation, and the like.
Can you explain what pluralistic ignorance is?
Yes, this is basically a systematic underestimation of social norms. So systematically perceiving that the people around me care much less about environmental sustainability than I do, when in fact they do care. So you can think of it in terms of perceiving a majority or a minority. And if we would go into a certain neighborhood and have a survey, we would find out often, I would say in Europe, it's around 70% of people. And I think in the United States, it's around 60% of people are, for example, concerned about climate change and willing to take action. But if we ask people which amount of people or which percentage of people in your community are worried about climate change and are willing to take action, they perceive it as a minority. And that is pluralistic ignorance, because they are largely underestimating how much other people care. And that is a barrier to more pro-environmental behavior.
Right. And what you said before, people can't always, it's creating this negative social feedback loop, because people can't always put their environmental attitudes out on display. They're not that easy to show in a way that you can I suppose you can explicitly put a sign out in front of your house, but people don't always do that. So people have these internal attitudes that is not very easy for them to show on the outside. And so nobody's showing them on the outside. So people are thinking they're basically making an error in their assessment of what or their normative expectations. They're thinking, oh, nobody cares because they're not doing it. But everyone sort of does care on the inside. And so you're sort of testing what happens if we put more social signals on the outside, how that actually sort of ripples through to the behavior.
Yeah, part of the problem is, again, social norms. It's not normal to talk about climate action. It's not normal to talk about one's worry about climate change and all of the problems that come with it. That's also something that we show in our survey. So we report a survey in this study in several Dutch neighborhoods, and we see very low averages for the question, do you talk with your neighbors about environmental issues? And that mirrors other research that has been published in environmental psychology. And so the normist perceptions that people form based on observing certain behaviors is kind of kept in place and exacerbated by the fact that people don't talk about environmental issues. It's something that we could do, but that isn't done very often.
And there's this phrase used called also self-silencing as something that goes along with the pluralistic ignorance. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, the idea here, or the idea with self-silencing, is that while people have high pro-environmental convictions, they are very concerned, they don't speak up about it. And there's probably a variety of reasons. There's actually not that much research on that yet. I've just recently published a paper on some of the reasons why people don't really like to talk about environmental issues. And part of it is definitely that they are worried about sparking conflict. It's a topic with a moral undertone, because environmental protection is about decreasing harm to current and future generations, to people around the world. So there's a certain moral imperative that being pro-environmental, acting pro-environmental is the better thing to do. And that makes it hard to call out unsustainable behaviors. It makes it sometimes hard to advocate it. And then other factors, or another important factor that many people consider when they think about whether or not they should speak about environmental issues, is that they perceive that it's not effective, that a single conversation won't really change much, and that it's potentially a dull or a boring topic to talk about, which is why they hold back on these issues and don't act on their convictions to speak about this more.
Yeah, it's been really fascinating doing all these interviews I've done with environmental psychologists like yourself. that it just comes up over and over again, the power of conversations between two people, especially neighbors as well, as being, it seems to be over and over again, is the way that social change and social behaviors spread. I mean, there's obviously other forces going on, but to just not underestimate how to stimulate or encourage these person-to-person conversations. And it's really made me think as a designer. I mean, I'm really an engineer who sort of likes to graphic design. I like to make and build things. But to really think about, if I was going to kind of manifest or manufacture conversations between two people, like what would I design? Like how would I curate or sort of like construct that experience, which is what I'm trying to kind of get to. So you tested these two different dynamics, which was, one was getting people to talk more and the other one was getting people to show more. You used the term visibility. What are your thoughts on, we're here as sort of like practical sustainability people trying to figure out, like what can I actually implement in a community, like in the real world? We've got ways to get people to talk to each other more, and we've got ways to do more visibility. Can you talk about ideas that you might have, like in a practical sense of if you're like running a climate campaign in a municipality and you're like, okay, I get it. I've got to get people to talk to each other more, got to get more signaling. What is that?
Yeah, I've also written a book chapter on this, specifically giving advice to practitioners and policymakers that are interested in using norm interventions. I'm sure you can find that somewhere out there in the web. That's in the Handbook on Pro-Environmental Change, I believe. And in this chapter, we brainstormed some ideas. And I think, so in the paper that we're currently discussing, we've simulated an intervention where people were agents, but we could conceptualize them as people, talk more with each other about their pro-environmental convictions. And we said that we saw that under certain conditions that leads to pro-environmental change on a collective level. And then we simulated an intervention where we said that people would make it become more visible. Those who engage in pro-environmental behavior become more visible. And we saw that that's a specifically effective strategy at creating pro-environmental change at a collective level. And I think there are many different ways in which we can foster conversations. This can be online. So we have neighborhood chat groups, generally like lots of chat groups. It doesn't have to be in a neighborhood context. I think it is worthwhile to think about it, think to apply these interventions in small to mid-sized communities, because what people are telling me or what I hear needs to be relevant to me. And some stranger is potentially not as relevant to me as some neighbor, as someone who goes to my school, someone who is my colleague at work. And then, yes, we can have these conversations online. We can also have these conversations on social media. And that has the potential added benefit of reaching my close contacts, but also other people, and thereby communicating that this is an accepted and endorsed thought by many people, if my content gets a lot of likes, for example. And then we can also talk about this in real life. So neighborhood meetups or stimulating it simply with a campaign on a neighborhood level. And then for increasing visibility, there's obviously behaviors that are more visible than others. So lots of research shows that solar panel adoption often spreads in neighborhoods, and part of it is visibility. The more visible solar panels are, the more they spread. And then there are obviously also behaviors that are less visible. And here we can create a flag, a badge, a sticker, a yard sign, something that lets other people know, hey, I've adopted, for example, this home energy upgrade. Are you interested in it? Come and ask me about it.
Yeah, when I was reading your paper, it made me think, even like I live in an apartment building and there's long hallways where everybody's doors open. Like I was thinking, what would a signal be? I was like, could you just have like a I'm an earth or an electric supporter or whatever, that would be like something that you would put on your door. We put up Christmas wreaths and Halloween wreaths. America's into all the festivals. There's always a wreath for every month. Something that would just say, I'm one of these people. And even I think it was OK Cupid, the dating site. Like you can tag yourself as being like a pro-climate in terms of your dating profile. I mean, I haven't used one of those dating sites for years, but I remember it had come up. So you'd be like, oh, that's interesting. You know, you've university, etc. Yes, pro-climate, etc. Was an interesting way of tagging people. And they do that with some of the online, I think Amazon does that in terms of the climate. They have some products that are meant to be like a pro-climate or something. So I like the yard signs as well. I have a yard sign template in a school that I'm hoping people will use sometime to put these sort of badges that houses get badges when they've done certain things. But I'm wondering, it just seems like it's a potentially powerful thing to do to find new and creative ways of signaling pro-environmental behaviors. And I'm wondering if there's any other ideas that you have for how these things can be signaled?
I want to say that I think it's important that the signal remains credible. So you mentioned Amazon putting it on certain products, and I think our study is different because we think about it in terms of people who engage in the behavior sending that signal. So a company sending that signal or a government sending that signal is potentially not as credible, because it really comes down to what individual people do and whether I also trust these people. And that's why I would say that visibility interventions work specifically well when they come out of a community, and when the whatever type of visibility we're using is really endorsed by individuals that I know and trust.
I circled one of these paragraphs here. Now, I knew this was going to be a bad idea, trying to find things on the printed one. I'm going to read this out to you because I'm particularly interested in neighborhood groups. I feel like the block leader neighborhood programs can be enormously powerful for trying to promote this. And it says here, neighborhoods may be a specifically relevant context for kickstarting such processes. Besides facilitating social influence processes, the connections between residents of different neighborhoods may also scale up change to larger parts of society. Can you expand a bit on that and maybe share some practical ideas of how folks can start to sort of stimulate that process?
There's research specifically on networks and how innovation spreads in networks, or how ideas spread in networks. I'm not aware of any type of that work in environmental psychology specifically. So I think that's really also something needs to be done in future research, investigating how interventions spread and how we can facilitate that spread. But the network research shows that people, on the one hand, have connections in this immediate social network that we are investigating. So someone who has lived several years in a neighborhood knows a decent amount of their neighbors and has a long-standing relationship with them. But then this person also has colleagues at work and has friends that are in a local sports club, for example, or a gym. And if we imagine that this person drives an EV that's maybe not immediately recognizable as an EV, but there's some sort of a symbol on it that says, hey, I have this EV, ask me about it if you have any questions, then of course this intervention that we potentially targeted at people in the neighborhood who have an EV can ripple out, because this person travels and has other connections in other social networks, where other people might also have adopted an EV and might be interested in adopting a sticker themselves, because they see, hey, it's actually normal to communicate to others that I care about environmental protection and that I take action. But it can also ripple out to other networks by convincing people to adopt the behavior, or by getting more information on the behavior and then eventually deciding to adopt the behavior. And so neighborhoods are a powerful network because we have the social influence in place. We've seen that with many, many studies that social influence occurs in neighborhood and is important for the adoption of sustainable technology. But people obviously have lives that happen outside of their neighborhoods, and that's where these interventions can potentially travel.
Yeah, it really seems like being able to see a change campaign as something that really piggybacks off the social network. It's not, I feel like people often who work in governments or NGOs, they see it as this like blanket wash. They're just like, we're going to do like a letterbox campaign or an email or a social media, and we've got this one size fits all, and we're just going to get it out to 100,000 people all at once. And then we'll just influence, sort of like a big radar goes over everybody. But it seems like that's really sort of not the way to do it. It's to really look at it like it is these networks of people, and you've got to get these changes or these adoptions in mindset and behaviors to really get somebody who's like an active person or let's say an early adopter in the community, and then see how it's going to piggyback off all of these different relationships and sort of spread, through this network effect. Seems to be, well, basically how it actually works in real life. And then when we're trying to design for it, to try to really design for that network effect or that social systems effect.
Yeah, the social networks are definitely powerful when it comes to disseminating an idea or a behavior change, really.
Okay. And let's dive into this concept of persistence. It doesn't often get talked about in that word, but that's like the word that is used in utilities and also in environmental psychology about making things last. And I'm just going to read, this is another sentence or paragraph that I circled from your paper. It says, making pro-environmental more visible creates lasting change, which is the persistence issue, and it leads to people to overestimate how important environmental protection is to others, which is the opposite of pluralistic ignorance, if you're following, in their social network. This intervention is also effective at producing long-lasting change with pro-environmental behavior and normative expectations remaining at new high levels once the intervention is removed. Can you explain that in easy to understand terms for us beginners?
Yeah, so this is a comparison that we kind of make also to the intervention where we have people or agents in our simulation talk more with each other. And there we see that once we remove the intervention, things kind of revert back to normal, and as into where the system was before we introduced the intervention, and that is not really enough pro-environmental behavior and also an underestimation of people's pro-environmental conviction. And the intervention that makes pro-environmental behavior more visible was a lot more effective, was a lot better at creating this lasting change. And there we see this overshoot in normative expectations. So all of a sudden, agents in our simulation already overestimated how much other people in their neighborhood cared about pro-environmental protection or pro-environmental actions. And that led to this lasting change in behavior where behaviors kept up with pro-environmental convictions, and so did normative expectations. But I do want to say this is just a simulation. This is a computer-based model, and we haven't really done the empirical work to say, okay, this is really how it is. This is just something that our simulations indicate that potentially it is more effective to visualize behavior than it is to just talk about convictions.
Right. So if you're looking at just sort of two different techniques, like whether to stimulate more conversations or whether to do more of the visibility work, which is getting people to show publicly that they're doing it, by the simulation, we'd be more leaning towards just getting people to visibly show wherever possible that they're doing it.
Part of that is potentially, at least that's what we hypothesize in the discussion of this paper, but it's also something that needs more research, is that it's more powerful. I can say that I am concerned, but if I don't see other people, if I don't show other people that I also act on that concern, I'm not necessarily that convincing. But if I show people, hey, I'm already doing this, I'm potentially a much more convincing agent of change, a much more convincing communicator. And I believe that's potentially part of why we could expect that making pro-environmental convictions or pro-environmental intentions, pro-environmental behavior more visible could be more impactful in the long term.
It's a bit of more nuance to the way I'd thought about it before, because when I think about environmental behaviors being visible, I just think about social norms as in people copying other people. If you've just got there's someone doing it in real life, we just copy them. But the way you've analyzed it, it has a deeper sort of level of nuances that we're not just copying them, where it's triggering a deeper assessment of our community, which says that these are the normative expectations of the community, which is offsetting this pluralistic ignorance, this kind of bias, almost like a negativity bias that we have, and bringing our own values kind of in to match what the perception of our community's values, to kind of create the underlying kind of values and an identity norm perception sort of framework that we have in the background of our psyche to kind of balance it out.
I would say a visibility intervention can profit from all of these things. It can mean that people are simply copying. I need a new car and I like the car that my neighbor has. Turns out it's an EV, but my neighbor says it works fine. So I'm adopting an EV, and that starts from simply wanting to copy somebody. But the visibility intervention can also, like you just said, really change our perception of what is normal, what is acceptable, which car should I be buying. And then it can also just make pro-environmental behavior top of mind. So that's maybe a third way in which such an intervention can work. And that is, once we have to make this decision, it is in our decision space. We consider this EV that our neighbor has as one of our options. And if our intention hadn't been drawn to it, maybe we wouldn't even consider it. And I think those are potentially like the three ways that all together make a visibility intervention a powerful intervention.
Right. Yeah. Does anybody want to open up to questions now? I've asked Tabea a lot of questions, and maybe there are burning questions from everybody. Do you want to put anyone who wants to ask a question, put your hand up? I'll turn my view to a gallery view so I can see you all. Put up a raised hand and I'll call you out to unmute yourself. There's a question here from Paula. Paula, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, Katie. Thank you. So I was inspired by the concept of normal. What is normal? What is our normality within, environmental and social behavioral change? And especially considering this very challenging moment that we are living, I would like to kindly ask you, or maybe, just share, how can we make normal or normality, to speak about climate change at all levels of society? So starting from the individual, the collective, meaning the neighborhood, and the broader societal level. And possibly these relate to also asking the question, what is normality, in relation to environmental issues and social issues? So yeah, that's some more about it. Thank you.
What is normal at the moment, unfortunately, is often a high consumption lifestyle. And in certain parts, it's very celebrated. So if you think of social media or the media generally, a lot of the times people, maybe some what we consider leaders in society, such as celebrities, are often celebrated for their very consumption-heavy lifestyles, and maybe people also gravitate towards. And I think that's really what makes norm change so important, that we need to have voices that also say, hey, this is not normal. And I think the responsibility is on everybody who cares about environmental protection and who understands that this should not be normal, and that this actually is harming to the world at large and future generations. And it also lies with other leaders in society that recognize this and that have the platform to send out this type of messaging. So I think it can both come from the top, in the sense of people that we pay specific attention to, that have really a large reach, but it can also come from the bottom, from grassroots organizations that define new ways of being, and also that describe new ways of what is desirable and what is something that we should strive towards too.
Thank you. Yes. And I also wonder about the different perspective, because obviously what is normal, we know that is for the majority of people, unfortunately, overconsumption. But maybe I was more thinking about us, let's say, people working in this field. So what is a normal, for us that we have in our unconscious mind? And how can we bring the other people, the majority of the people, towards, this normality?
I think one simple way is to start talking about it and to make it more visible to others. You potentially do a lot of things that other people don't know about, and that's specifically what we are also describing in this paper. So to really reach out to others, and there, like I said earlier, reasons why people hold back, but part of that is a norm misperception, because they think other people don't care to hear about this, or that they don't won't act on it. But we know from large scale surveys in many different countries in the world that the majority of people do care. And I also want to say, yes, overconsumption is normal, but also only in certain parts of the world, and also only in recent history. So sufficiency is something that has been shown to, and I'm not saying lack. I don't want to say that lacking things makes people happy, and there's too many people in the world who experience lack. But sufficiency has been shown to often make people happier. And what we need to do is to go out and advertise that type of lifestyle to others and say, hey, this is something that I had a great time with, and I suggest that you could try that for yourself too. Or I've adopted this sustainable technology and I've really experienced that. I've experienced it as a good thing. It really works for me. You could try it too. So it's a lot about people reaching out to others. And then also, like I said earlier, leaders, institutions, and so on, acting on the knowledge that a majority of people in many countries are worried about climate change and are willing to take action. And focusing less on these social normist perceptions that we are all, also policymakers, are subject to.
Many thanks.
Yeah, it really, this conversation, it is really sort of, I feel like it brings to light how important individual behaviors are in the social context. That when people talk about, an individual, like just an individual person just bringing your reusable bag to the store, or your reusable coffee cup, or just riding your bike, like these things are just such tiny drops in the ocean. They don't really matter in the context of, what sort of, for example, like the federal government is doing. But what it's really unveiling is just how critical these individual behaviors are when they are signaled to other people, when they are visible. So it's not just the individual behavior itself. It's like how many people saw that happen. That every time you do something or you get another person to do something and then everybody sees it, you are changing the social fabric by having that behavior be visible, which is an essential part of moving the entire system forward.
I think especially when a behavior is not normal yet. So potentially a lot of people think about it in positive ways already. Let's say biking is something that many people find desirable, this idea that you could bike to work, that you have less traffic on the street, which increases safety. But it's not super normal in many regions of the world. And then saying, I biked here, sparks also attention. And there's already a certain positive attitude towards it. And to see somebody else, or to hear that somebody else is biking, can potentially influence others and inspire them to a certain extent to hop on and also engage in a somewhat not normal behavior.
Yeah, and it really does. I've sold my car 2 years ago and I only have a bike, and I also have a dog and a child. So I'm often biking with my child on the back of my bike and my dog on the front. There's 3 of us on the bike. And because she's at school, like I'm often interacting with the other parents. And because I don't have a car, I'm often having to rely on the other parents to drive. If there's a birthday party, I have to be like, could you take my daughter? I don't have a car. Sorry, I can't drive. So just by the nature of me being car-free, it has forced me to have many conversations about my car-free life with the other parents when I'm just having to coordinate stuff or just apologizing, I'm sorry, it's raining, I don't have caffeine. They're like, why don't you have a car? And I'm like, well, partly because I don't want to have to manage it. But the other half is I really don't believe in cars. I don't want to own, I don't want to be part of like car culture. And then people think about it and they're like, oh yeah, what about electric? I'm like, we don't have electric things. And I don't think all these other parents are going to get rid of their cars, but it did create a whole bunch of conversations in my immediate community that I would have never had otherwise had I not had been doing the individual behavior myself. So yeah, all these individual behaviors, they can't help but sort of pollinate out into the world when you're doing them in a context that it's not normal. It's usually not normal for people to be car free where I live in the United States. But Harry's had his hand up. Would you like to ask your question, Harry?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much as well. This has been so interesting. I really appreciate it. I was wondering, and I think you touched on it at the beginning of the meeting today, but could you talk a little bit about the role of trust? I'm thinking particularly of the impact of things like greenwashing and how like the loss of trust could like how does it undermine like the impact of that on this buildup of what's normal, right? How significant are things like that?
Yeah, if we're misperceiving norms, a message has to work against this misperception. It has to convince the recipient of the message that whatever they're believing isn't true and they need to revise that belief. And that's a difficult thing to do. And it's unlikely, that's what psychological research shows. So again, the importance of psychology, right, for understanding how to send out a message, for example, and who should send the message and how should I craft the message. That psychology shows that if we don't trust the messenger or if we don't trust a message, then the message has no effect on us. So it's so crucial. So thanks for that question. Trust is so crucial. And that's why I think that a message coming from a community member is oftentimes more influential than a message coming from a company or a message coming. And then in the political situation, it really, I think, probably depends on the institution or the specific political leader or societal leader, whether or not I trust this person and whether or not, based on what they're saying, I'm willing to revise my misperception of the world, because it's a hard-earned perception that I've pieced together from observing many, many people and trying to figure out like what is normal. And what is normal is also a very powerful influence on our behavior. And so I'm probably not willing to easily adjust that belief, because it can be a costly mistake to do something that is not accepted. Not normal is maybe, okay, you're a little bit weird, but doing something that's not accepted, that can have very bad consequences. And so I really need to have trust in who's telling me normal is actually something else. Normal is not what you think is normal.
Did you work with, what was his name, Jan Bolderdijk at Groningen?
Yeah, Jan Willem is my PhD, or was now my PhD supervisor.
Oh, great. He did a great interview. I did an interview with him. It was probably 3 years ago now. And it's sort of an outlier in my podcast episodes. It's the most listened to one. And what I thought was a super interesting angle that I wish I could sort of get out more. I might need to do another interview with him just on this one topic. That it was about rebels sort of breaking the ice on behaviors, that when people do something that's unusual and they get pushback, they get really disheartened. They're like, I tried it. I went to a group of people and I talked about this thing that was really weird and unusual, and they all criticized me and told me to get out. And then they get totally disheartened. They were like, it's a total failure. But what his research showed was that those moments of perceived failure, when you go out and do something and people push back, and it's a really negative experience for the person who's sort of putting themselves out there, that it did not fail at all. It was like a critical sort of hitting of the ice, of breaking up the social fabric. And then maybe like another person will do it another time, and then another person will do it another time. And it might take a few hits of that very awkward sort of pushback. But then what it does is it breaks the ice, and then that eventually kind of becomes the new norm. And his research showing that these, what he calls them rebels, like people that do things that are very unusual, are playing this like critically important role in changing the new norm perception. And that if you're doing that, like you should not get upset, not lose heart if you're getting pushback. Like just keep doing it, because it's like totally working. Did you work on that with him, or can you talk a bit more about that?
I think it's specifically important to say that those are moral rebels. So they're not just rebels that do things differently, but they do something differently that has this moral undertone that I talked about earlier. So pro-environmental behavior is a moral behavior. And that's what makes it so risky to talk about it. And that's what makes it so risky to advertise it to other people, because it is potentially upsetting, because the underlying message, upsetting for the one who's receiving the message, the underlying message is, you are not a moral person because you are not engaging in this moral behavior, and I need you to engage in this moral behavior. And if a lot of the times pro-environmental behavior is not the most, maybe not the most pleasant behavior, because you cannot buy this new thing, or you cannot go on that far vacation. And sometimes it's also inconvenient, like your decision to take a bike everywhere, Katie. It's inconvenient. It's not very practical. And so being told that you're supposed to forego some of the joys of consumption and the comfort of it, of certain behaviors that we consider as normal and as desirable, can create this backlash in the recipient who says, well, who are you to tell me what's the moral thing to do? And why are you telling me this? I am a perfectly moral person. This is something that's very important to us also. Just as much as we want to be a normal person, we want to be seen as a moral person. That's important for being respected in our communities. And having that threatened by the messenger can really elicit backlash.
So how do people handle that? If they're, out there trying to signal in a way that's hopefully not going to agitate anybody, do you suggest that people can signal what their behavior is as much as possible and either reduce the backlash or become emotionally hardier to it? Because I don't know, I don't really get any backlash from stuff that I do. I don't know I wonder if when people get that sense of backlash, it's more because they've been a little bit impolite about it.
Yeah, I wonder. I personally don't get that type of backlash either, but I also don't hardcore advertise for pro-environmental behavior in the sense of that I really try to tell somebody off or really tell them the way you're going about it is not right. So I try to more give examples or give inspiration. Bigger picture, I talked about it earlier. We've recently published this paper where we investigate the barriers to talking about environmental issues. And there we show that the context of the conversation really matters, and that people are much more willing to talk about system level change than individual level change, or talk about environmental issues on a system level with a system level lens and an individual level lens. And so if I had to give any advice to people, I would say, bring whatever environmental issue that you care about on a system level and advocate for that system level and find a conversation on that level. And then maybe with a lot of care, transition into also the need for individual level change and potentially how that constitutes system level change to some extent.
I found on Balderdijk's research about the sort of knowing that it was working, even if you had a negative experience, just hugely emotionally supportive in my understanding, that I was thinking, if I'm going out and talking to people and people are pushing back, like, that's not a bad thing. Because normally if people are pushing back, you would feel like, oh, that's really negative. If I go to my school and I talk to all the teachers and then they all say like, oh, we hate that stuff, Katie. We like our plastic lunch. The sort of, so, oh, we want to eat meat. We don't want to have to do anything that's inconvenient. And then, even if they're polite about it, but they're like complaining and don't want to do it, as some people do, I would feel really, really squished. I'd be like, oh my God, I just went and talked to all these people about it. And then they all said no. And it was just like really humiliating. But then when I just know about that research, that I'm like, oh, well, I'm actually doing like this critical job of pushing against these barriers. And even if they say no, like I've done something really important. And then when you just know, when you kind of recalibrate your expectation to know that you're going to have like negative pushback. It's okay to just go, and you can feel more sort of emotionally resilient to being able to have those awkward and difficult interpersonal conversations. Does anybody want to have any more questions? Anybody want to put their digital hand up or real hand? Patricio, real hand.
Yes, I can see how, and I've seen it myself, of how socializing these new behaviors can bring more people No, for example, like planting trees with neighbors and in other neighborhoods and defending a tree and signing for that and making an event around the tree. That is very visible because if you're walking through the street, you can see it, and that attracts so much more people. And that's kind of easy in a way because there's this visual element to it and experiential element. But what happens when it's a private habit and change of mind, for example, like urban agriculture, and I might do it in my apartment, and how do I socialize this idea and communicate it to other people and make it attractive because so many other people are doing it? I know, but we're all isolated in our apartments or houses and so on. Thank you.
I think, yeah, so there you really have to work with something that makes it more visible to others. If you live in a bigger house, a yard sign. If you live in an apartment building, a sticker. It could be a message on a neighborhood group, messaging group, for example. And potentially it also works best together, right? So on the one hand, you can do this visualization and to just let people know this is something I do. This is something that I appreciate. And so there's a certain level of updating happening, what people are doing in a certain community. But then to, on top of that, be willing to talk about, and I mentioned this earlier, that this sticker or this sign could have a message or a prompt, something like, ask me about it if you're interested. I think the combination of making something more visible and then to talk about it, it can be really powerful. And we did a field study in a Dutch neighborhood, in a Dutch city, where we also show that we gave people a yard sign when they were willing to engage in this urban greening initiative that we offered to residents. And everybody was willing to accept the yard sign. And what it showed is that these yard signs really drew in conversations. So either because people already all of a sudden felt, hey, I have this yard sign now, I'm on this mission, I'm part of this initiative, and I believe in it, and I want my neighbors to engage in it as well. But maybe also because neighbors, and we have survey data on this, it shows that both ways it kind of worked. Neighbors came to them and they were like, hey, you have this yard sign, what is this about? They kind of missed on the initiative, they didn't know it was happening. And then that led to them also signing up for the greening initiative. And then in the end, so in the Netherlands, there's a problem with people putting concrete tiles in their front yards instead of plants. And we took over 500 of these concrete tiles out of that neighborhood and brought plants in. And all because of the power of a really small yard sign that a few neighbors were willing to adopt.
Wow, that's an amazing story. Patricio and Maria, have you guys caught up in Mexico City? Have you met each other in real life?
I'm really happy and surprised to see Patricia here. Hello, Pato.
Hola, Maria. Yes, we knew each other from before, from an urban agriculture workshop.
We are good friends.
Oh, exciting. So you're already, great. That's exciting. Okay. I'm just going to post something an image in the chat. Just thinking about apartments and signaling. There was this, I think this happened in COVID. There was a guy an artist, it's got nothing to do with environmental stuff, but it's kind of interesting. He did this picture of a honey bear. Like we have these, I mean, maybe you don't have them in different countries where everyone's from a different country here, but the honey that you get in a plastic bottle that's the shape of a bear. So he did a picture of it with a mask on it. And then he put it in his window. So in San Francisco, the windows of apartments are very visible from the street. So you can see other people's apartment windows. And then he sold it online and it sort of went viral and everybody started buying them. I think he made like $150,000 in a month or something with some story. And then everybody started buying these honey bears and putting them in their windows. So if you're living somewhere that in apartments that are visible, that can be like you could create, you're an artist, Patricio, you could do something like that.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I'm already...
And put it in the window or even outside if it's waterproof. And then if it's something that's replicable, it's not just one artwork, but it's something that is almost like a brand, like I'm like a part of this movement or something, you can put it out there and people are like, what is that? Why do I keep seeing that thing here? Why is there a carrot with eyes holding a guitar everywhere? What is this,
Love that idea. Yes. Something that it's easy to either print or make, maybe even with some recyclable materials, something that it's available for everyone. Love that.
Yeah, and if anyone doesn't know, the reason why I said a carrot with eyes playing a guitar is because, you tell why would I come up with that idea of a carrot playing a guitar for you, Patricio?
Yes, I love that.
No, but why? I just wanted you to explain it, so I don't explain what you do for you.
Okay. Yes, sorry. So I make music with plants and my guitar. So I connect electrodes to plants and they send a very subtle electrical signal, and that signal I translate into sounds, and also with vegetables. So with the vegetables is a little bit the other way around. Like I assign a sound to them and they can sound it as percussions. And with the vegetables, they sound like this atmospheric sounds. And yeah, it's great. And I would like to, thanks to Katie's suggestion, to have maybe some rooftop sessions, because there's so many rooftops in Mexico City and everywhere in the world pretty much, where maybe people can have their own gardens and then also perform there. And I think that would be so much fun.
Yeah, thank you. I think rooftops are a super exciting place to explore. Maria, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Based on this conversation, I'm wondering, I mean, this is a very polarized world, specifically right now. I think it's very difficult, the environmental education in these times, because, and I'm thinking specifically about social media, because I am wondering, when does a person stop listening and then decivilizing and communicating more of what you already do becomes, I mean, people stops listening. I mean, people blocks you because they do not want to listen to anything else related to the environmental topic. So I don't know how to find a balance between communicating in a way that shows care, but also not going too far in a sense that people blocks you.
I think part of the question is, why are people blocking you? So is it simply because they are being bombarded with a message and they're like oversaturated with the message? Maybe then the message needs to change, needs to come in different ways, and potentially also needs to become less frequently. Social influence doesn't mean forcing people. Social influence means that people voluntarily change because they're inspired by you, they're copying you, or because you brought it to the top of their mind. Or potentially, well, there's also, but it's a small percentage. So I think many people overestimate how many people really don't believe in climate change. But and that percentage is kind of lost. I think that is not a percentage that we need to be focusing on. We need to be focusing on the majority of people that are worried, and a lot of them are not taking many actions yet, but they could. And that's where your messaging needs to hit. Don't try to convince somebody who is bogged down in conspiracist beliefs, who is caught in a social bubble also that reinforces the belief that climate change isn't real. That's, at least I think, that social norm interventions will not do anything here. That's really where you need to talk with people that look at conspiracist beliefs and belief networks and so on. And then maybe people are blocking you, like we said earlier, because you are a moral rebel. And there are some strategies out there as well, such as showing self-compassion, or showing that you have changed yourself and that change is possible. And then sometimes people also accuse you of being a hypocrite, for example, because you're not perfectly acting on every pro-environmental behavior. You're not fully sustainable. And there, I think, again, it's fair to say, well, I am also changing. And this message of change has been shown in environmental psychology to be very impactful.
Thank you.
All right. I might just sort of wrap it up with a few questions to my final questions to finish off the interview. What do you think are big mistakes sustainability and climate managers make that they can avoid making in community engagement?
I'm not sure. I don't know. Yeah, maybe a big mistake is that Science and policymakers are often not connected enough. So I'm actually not on top of what other people are doing wrong. Maybe that's also something that us researchers need to become better at, connecting more with policymakers. And some of my work was very practical. So some of my PhD projects have been conducted together with volunteer organizations and municipalities, but I don't think that's very common. And so I think, yeah.
Or maybe I
Connecting-
phrased it wrong rather than big mistakes, just things to avoid. If you've got to get out to a whole bunch of people and persuade them to do something, what's something that you should avoid doing?
I think that people are not reaching out enough yet. So if I think about all of the places that I've lived in, and it's been a few different countries by now and a few different cities, rarely has anybody reached out to me about sustainability and about sustainability initiatives in my neighborhood or in my city. So a part of it is actually, it starts with reaching out and bringing initiatives that are happening, because I know that these things are happening, to the people that are interested in them.
And if you were working for a city and you were to put together like a gold standard sort of practice, you know, for the EPA, a government department, a local municipality, what would just sort of be the ABCs of trying to get that sort of gold standard practice in place for people, often people who are scientists and engineers and just don't have a psychology or social science background?
Potentially start with research into your community, understand the social fabric of the community that you are thinking to message to or intervene. I think that often specific neighborhoods are targeted for specific problems. Understand, for example, where current norm perceptions are, levels of conviction, behavior, what are behavioral trends. And based on this very real information about a community, create interventions. And then also create these interventions, reach out to there's so many people in environmental psychology and adjacent fields, and potentially reach out to them. I think many researchers are interested in working more closely with policymakers and co-create solutions together with experts, behavioral insight experts, and with the community where you are trying to intervene. There's often neighborhood level organizations, people who are somewhat of a representative of that community, and involve them in co-creating solutions and then monitor solutions as we implement them. So plan for more surveys, for example, or other ways of evaluating how well an intervention did to learn for future interventions. And then also, don't be too quick with applying interventions in a certain community, because it can lose trust, it can backfire. And so piloting and potentially doing a computer simulation, finding somebody who can help with doing a first step of exploring an idea in a much less high stakes, in a low stakes environment, can be beneficial to apply, because behavioral insights have a lot of promise for interventions, but we shouldn't rush into them, I think.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm hoping to do with this community, is bring together the environmental psychology experts together with the sustainability practitioners. At least at this forum we have on Mighty Networks, I can start bringing people together and then hopefully sort of inch towards that greater understanding, or those procedures of how to bring in the more of the hypothesis and testing and research into the process. And what are you most excited about in your future research?
Creating solutions, I think, for pro-environmental change. And yeah, finding ways to create a more sustainable and just society for today and in the future. And that can be, I'm excited about very different types of projects. So on the one hand, these more simulation-based research, but also really field work where I work with certain communities or certain people and then test out a intervention that was crafted in like lab work or online work. Yeah.
Let's skip to, say, 100 years in the future. Where would you like to see the field of environmental psychology sort of come into its full impact in the world? What would be something you would like to see it grow to?
Well, environmental psychology needs more funding. So we need, it's real. We're losing funding left, right, and center, which means we're losing insights. And so I would hope that there is more academic positions for people that do the type of work that I do, that there's more funding for example, longitudinal studies. So in this agent-based model that we talked about is we are thinking about a process over time, but doing these studies in real life is very effortful. It needs a lot of manpower. It needs a lot of money to be able to carry out the different steps in this project. And so really seeing more resources poured into that, because that means there's a stronger focus on sustainability. It means that as a society, we have decided that this is something that is important. And well, in 100 years, I also hope that we've already created some solutions and that we've created a lot of change, because that's what we need if we want to mitigate climate change. In 100 years, there should already be a large impact of environmental psychology.
Well, hopefully if we can bring together, I think, the practitioners like the cities and the departments and the not-for-profits who are on the ground to create closer collaboration with the research departments, we could have those budgets overlap and, have the impact that we really want to see.
Yeah, these types of collaborations will be important that for environmental psychology to have any type of impact in the next 100 years.
Yeah, cool. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show, Tabea, and exploring your fascinating research and giving us more insight into these more subtle social dynamics between the signaling and and conversations between people. So how can people contact you, or would you like people to contact you to further understand your research or your work?
Yeah, sure. I think LinkedIn is probably a good place, because that profile stays no matter which email address I currently have. And it's almost the only professional social network that I'm currently on. Yeah, and thank you so much for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Okay, thanks so much.